Welcome to Lecture 4. This is the second lecture of Module 2. This correlates to Chapter 4 of your textbook, where we ask the question, how do we choose between qualitative and quantitative research? We have touched upon the differences between qualitative and quantitative research in earlier sections of this course, and in the earlier chapters you would have read that as well. What we will try to do in this lecture is to address the differences in a little more detail. So let me ask you, which research is more effective, more useful, and more valuable? Is qualitative better or is quantitative better? Okay, if you've already figured it out, that is a non-question. The choice of methodology is determined by the research question. There isn't a better way of research. The applicability of both types of research will change depending on what the question is and what methodology you use to collect data and answer your question. However, there's no such thing as one research being better than another or superior to another. It's all contextually defined, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So qualitative research tries to give us an impression. If you want to document what feelings people experience when they get to hold a puppy, or what does it feel like to be the only female child in a large family of 8 siblings? How did you feel when you won a scholarship or an award or a trophy? These are things that quantitative research simply cannot do. The focus of qualitative research is on the term phenomenology, and it is a tongue twister, but it is a real word. The idea of phenomenology is finding out what is going on in a situation, and most times it is from either the perspective of the participant or participants or from the perspective of the observer, which is the researcher. Quantitative research does not focus on phenomenology. Quantitative research focuses on other things, and we will talk about it shortly. So if you think about an example of racialized youth seeking employment, this is a project done by the authors of your textbook, one of the authors in your textbook in Winnipeg, and they were studying how racialized youth felt about seeking employment in Winnipeg. The focus was not in this example that the authors have. The focus was not on the numbers of racialized youth or how many attempts they made at securing a job, how many interviews they got in a year, and so on. That wasn't the focus. The focus was on figuring out what it feels like. What does it do to your mental health, to your well-being? What does it do to a racialized youth's levels of anxiety? Different things. They didn't try to determine what they were going to find out, but the idea was they were trying to look at the experience of these youth from their perspective. The author would have had to interview a lot of these young people, describe their lives and the challenges that they encountered. So let's say you had to put together a questionnaire to interview somebody different about their experiences. Say they were someone different from who you were. So if you are a Caucasian, a white Canadian, perhaps interviewing someone who is a Middle Eastern Canadian and talking about their experience. So finding, say, for example, you live in a house owned by a parent, so you own your home and you're talking to what it feels like to be a tenant. Basically, people who was completely different and had a very different context and perspective. What would you do? It's complex because the author in the textbook, her name's Laurie Wilkinson, she's a white female. She didn't have enough of a background to create a relevant interview schedule at first when she wanted to talk to racialized youth. And it was important because the questions she had in mind were really irrelevant for the racialized youth in Canada. Um, so she really had to start from the very first interview and create the questions as she went along. One of the things about qualitative research is often you can start with a singular question and build the questions as you go through the interview process, as you interview more and more people, as you start to uncover more themes, more topics, which start to emerge and become more relevant. A challenge often with qualitative research, especially when research is being done uh, using people or working with participants who are of a different background, is researchers often come in with biases and preconceptions. So the key is for a good researcher to have a peer colleague or a different set of eyes to whom they can declare their preconceptions. Just look at biases that they might have when looking at the data itself. Experienced researchers will often do an exercise just by themselves to try to figure out what their biases are. Um, but it works better when there's a team because it's more than just one or two people with a narrow subjective perspective. Sometimes interviews and focus groups um, can provide a biographical perspective for the group that you're trying to study, and thereby preliminary interviews and focus groups can serve as a source for more concepts and more questions in qualitative research. So again, it depends entirely on your question as to whether you would choose a qualitative research method or not. And then there are obviously things that one has to consider when doing qualitative research. These preliminary interviews and focus group, like I said, they set up the stage for future questions. So when do we use qualitative research? If you wanted to study a feeling of what does visiting X provoke, so this could be a good thing. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. Some people aren't very comfortable, say, visiting a hospital because it gives them a feeling of unhealthy people or doom and gloom and so on. Some people don't like to visit amusement parks because they get anxious because of the long lines, lots of rush, very noisy, so on. So if you wanted to understand what feeling a certain visit provokes, that's something that you would use qualitative research to answer. As we mentioned before, we would use qualitative research to understand a phenomena, to understand perhaps a cultural context as well. This is covered in a later chapter where we go into detail about cultural and action frameworks for qualitative research, because qualitative research gives us answers, identifies concepts, and demonstrates link between concepts. However, the relationship, the existence of concepts and the relationship between concepts is very context specific and framework specific. So this is something we'll explore later. The key thing to remember is these are situations where you would use qualitative research. The key thing about qualitative research is understanding the individual truth. It's an individual lens. So two people can go through an experience which they experience very, very differently, even though to the outsider the experience might be entirely the same. Let's take the example of, let's say, running a 5-kilometer race. Now, with between all the students in the class, some of you have never run a race as a contest. Some of you regularly run 5 kilometers as part of your weekly or daily fitness routine, and some are perhaps running longer distances, maybe even marathons. So if all of you were to run a 5K race, even though you've all covered the same distance on the same day, perhaps even participated in the same race, I think it's quite easy to understand that each of you has a different lens on how that situation turned out for you. For some of you, it might have been, oh, I just got warmed up. For some of you, it might be like, oh my God, I had to stop every few minutes to take a breath and to get a drink of water. And for still a few others, it might be, oh, that was good. That was my workout for the day. So everyone has a different interpretation of the same reality. And that's where qualitative research comes in, to understand that individual perspective. Qualitative research uses something called inductive reasoning, and the idea of inductive reasoning is that because the sample sizes don't tend to be huge, the theory, the concepts obtained from few people is used to create the framework to be able to extrapolate those concepts, those ideas, the linkage between the concepts to larger groups and perhaps larger sections of the population itself. In order to do all the things that you need to do for qualitative research, there are some data collection strategies. Often, data is collected in the form of video recordings, audio recordings, text, or material. And the data here is put through a process known as content analysis. And the idea is to parse the content, whether it's audio, video, just audio, or just video, and look for themes, look for phenomena, look for a feeling that might come out of these situations to be able to identify concepts. Very often, interviews, both unstructured or semi-structured, are used to collect data. Structured interviews, particularly rigidly structured interviews, tend to be more like questionnaires and end up serving more a quantitative research data collection strategy. But both unstructured and semi-structured interviews are often used with questions which are considered open-ended to allow the interviewee to speak at length and in a great amount of detail. And they're obviously taped or recorded. Sometimes it might be in the form of notes. And then people try to look at what's being said, what is the context, and identify themes and create a context around what was spoken or said. In unstructured interviews, typically there are no planned questions in a sense, because the idea is to give voice to the speaker. So if all questions are planned and the interviewee is constantly redirected, then there's a good chance that the richness of the data would be lacking. For semi-structured interviews, what happens is in the idea of getting through a bunch of themes and topics that are important to the researcher, there might be a dozen questions, and a clever or a skilled interviewer will, while absorbing the richness of the content presented as answers, be able to redirect the interviewee from one question to the next. So for semi-structured interviews, what typically happens is there is a question pool that the researcher has and that they can work with. And it is this question pool that they use to ask questions of the interviewees. Oftentimes, the same questions may not be asked to two separate interviewees, but the key is that the entire schedule of questions would cover all of the topics or themes that the interviewer wants to start with. One data collection strategy for qualitative research is participant observation. In participant observation, usually the researcher, with ethics approval obviously, will have a vantage point at viewing or reviewing actions, behaviors, the context in which these actions occurred, these behaviors occurred, and so on. This is known as the only difference between being a participant observer and being, say, a distant or a non-participant observer is often a participant observer is actively part of the experiment itself or the observation itself. So, for example, if you were to attend a rock concert as as an attendee, and you were observing people around you participating in the concert, cheering loudly. There's lots of drinking going on. There are people consuming drugs. There's rowdy behavior. Perhaps people are having lots of fun. Perhaps there are tailgate parties. Whatever it is, and if you are involved directly in it, so you would be a participant and you would be an observer at the same time. So that kind of an observation is called being a participant observer. Obviously, it's harder to convince a research and ethics board that you should be a participant observer, say, in a prison situation or a riot situation. Another way of collecting data is the photo voice method. The photo voice method isn't new anymore, but it's the idea that participants typically take pictures and accompany or provide a description of the image, the context in which the picture was taken, and why they thought it was important. So it is another way of collecting data. So now we move on to quantitative research. So if qualitative data is as rich as it is and provides individual perspectives, people's lived truths and their experiences, why bother with quantitative research? In fact, there is so much emphasis on quantitative research that all policies, national policies, provincial policies, municipal policies are based on data that comes out of quantitative research. One key benefit of quantitative research is the property of generalizability. Quantitative researchers acknowledge that their data is not trying to find out an individual perspective on anything. So let's think about an example. If the province wanted to permit the use of a drug to treat a certain condition, let's say severe flu infections, rather than get individual perspectives of 10 to 15 people with detailed interviews on how they encountered the flu and how the vaccine helped them from perhaps getting the disease, it's far more beneficial for a province to know how many shots were administered in different countries across the globe using a certain flu vaccine and how much it reduced hospital admissions or how many people did not actually end up getting the flu, right? So it's a lot of mass big data, and obviously it helps with creating policy that has to be administered to the larger public, to the general public. There are several differences between qualitative and quantitative results. We spoke about qualitative results using an inductive approach. you induce what you know. The opposite to the word inductive is deductive. Quantitative research uses a deductive approach, which means you have a large amount of data and you're studying two concepts that are associated with one another. This enormous amount of data should point to the fact as to the strength of the relationship between the two variables. So this kind of an approach is called a deductive approach. A deductive approach is also known as a top-down approach. Basically, you decide the relationship first and use the data to validate it. An inductive approach is considered a bottom-up approach. So they're different in that sense. Quantitative research tends to be positivist in nature. And what that means is when you say something is positivist, it means that a relationship has already been assumed. Concepts have already been identified, and the only purpose of collecting data is to validate or refute a certain relationship. Again, since we answered earlier as to which approach is better, we will not try to answer it a second time. This is a useful table that you will see in the module as well. So it's a contrast between positivist and phenomenological approaches. So this is qualitative, and this is quantitative. Now, I want to make it very clear to all of you, while a quantitative research methodology is attempting to test the association between two concepts, and there might exist a hypothesis that suggests that change in one is related to change in another, this is not meant to suggest that the answer is a fix or pre-decided. Very often, hypotheses in quantitative research is disproved because the data suggests that there might be either no association or the expectation that the independent variable influences the dependent variable might not be the same way as the researchers think it might. It may not be a positive correlation, it might be a negative correlation, and so on. So it doesn't, positivist approach doesn't necessarily mean that data is found to justify the hypothesis. That is not necessarily the case. But there are different features to a positivist approach, and that's what this table is supposed to indicate. Basically, positivist approach believes that the world is external and objective. Science is value-free. Look at the opposites for phenomenological approaches. The world is constructed and subjective, so the world is different for every person. Positivist approach says, well, science is unbiased and value-free. But a phenomenological approach says the science is driven by human interests. Positivist approach assumes that the focus is on facts. But what is a fact is very, very subjective. So the phenomenological approach recognizes that. The goal of the positivist approach is to formulate a hypothesis and then test the hypothesis. Phenomenological approaches don't have hypotheses. They start at a point to know more. They collect data, and then they construct theories and models. So the question leads to data, and data leads to the construction of theories and models. Positivist research tries to look at cause and effect between variables. And that's not the interest of phenomenological approaches. It wants to understand what is happening. As a result of a phenomenological approach, you might uncover concepts in variables. And this is important. We'll get into it as to why this idea is important, that a phenomenological approach will uncover concepts. A positivist approach operationalizes concepts of measurement. So it assumes that for any concept, which is a basket of ideas, there is a variable that sufficiently represents the concept accurately, and it's reliable. And usually different researchers in quantitative research will accept that variable as a reasonable measure. But in qualitative research, it is accepted that views and perspectives are different, and there might be multiple ways to look at each of these views. The idea of a positivist approach is to look at very large samples so that a general truth might be uncovered that can be applicable to the entire population. A phenomenological approach does not care about broad-scale applicability. The focus is to look at small samples in great depth over a period of time to understand the central truths to it. So going back to uncovering of concepts in qualitative research, if you're not already thinking about this, perhaps you will at some point to ask, well, if you're going to uncover concepts in qualitative research, and the goal of quantitative research is to relate concepts to one another and find out how much of a change there is, couldn't both approaches be combined? And the answer to your question is they can be, and they already are. And that kind of research, I apologize, is known as mixed methods research. Mixed methods research require a lot of different skill sets from the research group or team, because you need good qualitative researchers and good quantitative researchers who work well with each other. But mixed methods research is often done, and one form of research can act as a precursor for the second form. This is a second table to kind of summarize the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. It overlaps a little bit between the positivist and phenomenological approach, but it also talks about practical presentations. So when you look at quantitative research, it tends to be positivist, which suggests that there is a relationship which is being tested. Quantitative research works mostly with numbers, graphs, that kind of data. It uses the researcher's perspective, which is considered the most important because they're the one proposing the theory and working on it. It works on using a representative sample. Just as an opposite, qualitative research tries to understand phenomena. The description is in words, and the participant's view is considered most important. Samples are not selected to be able to generalize. Samples are selected specifically for a certain reason. For example, to find out what it feels like to be an older adult who has been racialized. There's simply no point in picking up a random sample from the general population. A researcher is benefited by speaking to specific ethnic groups in Canada who have grown older in Canada and have endured a lifetime of different kinds of challenges. As we previously mentioned, quantitative research focuses in presenting data as tables or graphs. Qualitative results are expressed in the form of extracts and quotes. You have sentences or paragraphs from the interviewees. There is distance between the researcher and the data in quantitative research, whereas qualitative research depends on the proximity between the researcher and the participants. Again, a deductive approach versus an inductive approach. This is a very important difference. Once the methodology is chosen in quantitative research, once you know your variables, you know your instruments of measure, and you start collecting data, pretty much nothing changes. The data is collected the same way until you reach the required sample size, and then you analyze. Qualitative research is very much a process because there isn't a fixed theory. Often the instruments to collect or process data aren't determined, while an interview process may be decided on early on as a method to capture initial data. Because there's no preconception or idea of concepts or what questions might be asked, it might start very loosely and then get structured as it goes along. Quantitative research tends to be quite structured. Qualitative tends to be unstructured, with structure starting to form at the later stages of the research. Hard, reliable data or objective data is obtained in quantitative research. And data that you get from qualitative is rich and deep and very personal data. The effectiveness of a vaccine is a general information. 500,000 out of a million will be immune to the flu this year as a result of taking the vaccine. It's very general data. It has very little to do with the context. It's dealing with large numbers. Qualitative information is always contextual. So for an individual from India to experience racism and discrimination and bias in Canada, it's very contextual because not all Indians have experienced this. Indians in India have not experienced racism, or at least should not have experienced racism, because at least the racial differences don't exist. So that's unique to immigrants coming to the country, right? So it's all contextual. So those are things to understand. So quantitative data studies behaviors, not necessarily the meaning, studies the symptoms, not necessarily the problem, the meaning, the depth. Qualitative is quite different. It looks for everything that's hidden under the surface, beneath the surface, off the visible part of the iceberg. Quantitative data looks at macro, large phenomena, which kind of correlates with generalization. And qualitative doesn't really care about generalizability. It recognizes each individual truth to be valuable. So I think with all of these slides, it's become quite clear to you as to what to expect in qualitative and quantitative research. Since you haven't done any of the research yet, it will still be a while for you to get attuned to how to ask the question and how to solve the question, how to write up a proposal in using either of these methods. Again, go through chapter 4, answer the questions in the back. Okay, that's important. We'll move on to a different concept now, and that is primary versus secondary research. So let's say that your experiment was to collect data, or your method of collecting data was to document responsive behaviors in a long-term care home, before introduction of classical music. For 30 minutes a day. And then collect data after. Okay. So as you can see, what this is a description of is of a research student or researcher collecting data for a very specific purpose. And then you can imagine that as the study is concluded, the researcher will probably comment about the role of classical music, either positively influencing responsive behaviors or not. And this kind of data collection or research is known as primary research. You set out to collect data for a certain purpose and you use it. Now, with this data being available to the researcher and their knowledge of the long-term care home and perhaps some understanding of how old the residents are, whether male or female, perhaps there is data on the, there's named data so they know which person is engaging in what kind of behaviors and how it's impacted them. And perhaps there's a good idea of other physical and mental limitations that each of these people have. Since all of that data is collected in the context of this one project, it's all considered primary data. Now, if 5 years down the line, the researcher wishes to use the same data set to look at other aspects of the research which they may have previously not considered. So basically reusing the same data for a different purpose or repurposing the data. It's called secondary use. So data can be used multiple ways. However, depending on what the context is and what kind of data is going to be analyzed, oftentimes secondary use of data might require the researcher to go to the Research Ethics Board and explain to them as to how they would use the secondary data. The Research Ethics Board of a university might instruct the researcher to obtain a fresh set of permission, even though they may not be collecting data again. They might have to get new permission from the caregivers or the families of the people being observed or engaged in previously in order to be able to look at the data in a different way and to reuse that data. Sometimes secondary data or secondary research is not an issue. For example, Statistics Canada collects census information from everybody in Canada. For us to use that data, which is primarily collected for the purpose of census, to do different kinds of analysis does not require ethics approval because the data is completely de-identified, and really it would be more trouble to actually get permission from all of those people from whom the census data was taken to give consent to go ahead and do the research anyway. So it's context dependent as to when secondary data is okay to use and when it's not. So let's spend the rest of this lecture thinking about a little exercise. Imagine that you've been hired by a college or university admissions office to review their recruiting methods and materials. So Laurentian hires all of you. Let's take a look at recruiting methods and materials. As a really bright student who's done research literacy and is in the research methods course, you choose to organize a focus group of students who are thinking of coming to the university. So what I want you to think about is, what's your focus group going to look like? How are you going to find and select the participants? How old do you think the group will be? Is it going to be males, females, undetermined gender, combination of both? Is their hometown important? Is their current high school important? Because it is a focus group, is there going to be a quantitative component to your research? Or which part is going to be qualitative, which part is quantitative? Think about it and explain your reasoning. What is the issue you really want to cover? What is the topic? So an issue is a larger basket of things. And it may have a bunch of different topics. Now, are you going to create a research statement? What is that going to look like? So as you're thinking about these, think of 5 relevant questions. Not too many, just 5, having to do with the research topic but this is something you want the focus group to be able to respond to. Think about how your own experiences as a university student influence how you design and carry out the research. What will you have to bracket, or what will you have to identify as your own biases in order to be able to ask relevant questions without your own perspective coming in the way? Because remember, if you're trying to get student perspectives, you don't want to taint it by your experiences alone. Another little exercise. Consider the possible association between self-esteem and academic grades. Okay, this is discussed in this chapter. So try to describe this relationship using both an inductive and a deductive approach. So think of a qualitative method. Think of a quantitative method. So an example of a quantitative method, I'm going to give you a break here. I'm going to tell you what it is. So if you have a self-esteem scale that you can generate or find, and academic grades obviously is something that you'd have to survey the student for and hope they answer honestly. So it is possible to get a score of self-esteem, and then if the students were honest, it's also possible for you to be able to correlate that score to a certain academic performance or grade. Okay. Think about a qualitative method. Are you going to talk to students about self-esteem and how they feel about their academic performance so far, how they feel about university? Do they feel positive? Do they feel excited? Do they look forward to finishing up their degree and joining the workforce? And think about how you might be able to combine both approaches in a singular study. These thinking, reflecting exercises are for you to just think over and mull over and figure out how all of this research works. Again, we are at the end of the lecture component. Be sure to read a chapter if you haven't done so already. Sometimes it may take a second read. You may not be able to absorb all of the new material that you're encountering the first time. Take your time, don't rush through it. The formula for success in this course is to do it in bite-sized pieces, do a little bit every day, rather than spending 3 hours going through a chapter and module and a section and having very little retained in your mind. It's better to spend maybe half an hour to 45 minutes every day doing little bit bite-sized pieces and thinking about it, reflecting upon what you read and what you learn, and being successful at understanding and absorbing the material. All right? All right, this is it for this lecture. See you all in Lecture 5.